the Asian American Forward podcast. This week on the show, we have a book review, and we think that it's going to resonate with your experience this past year. We're discussing Albert Camus' novel, The Plague. I have for the people who watch on the YouTube channel, picture of the book right here. And joining me to discuss The Plague this week, of course, is, as always, my co-host, Don Sun. Hi, Don.
Hi, Katie. Hi, my friend here, and welcome to our podcast.
It's good to talk to you this week. I'm excited to swap notes about your experience of reading the book. And I don't know if saying that I enjoyed reading The Plague is the right way to describe my experience, but it definitely was fascinating and a very timely read. So today I'd sort of like to, of course, summarize the book and what happens, but also I wanted to do a little bit of literary digging and research and give the readers some context about Camus was a very philosophical writer and also about the historical period in which this book was written. So once we've done that, we can sort of compare the book to our own personal experience and then talk about what we're going to take away from this book this year. So getting all of that out of the way, I wanted to jump in with some context. So as you might have been able to guess from the title, this book is about an epidemic and it recounts a fictional outbreak of the bubonic plague, although I don't think it's ever named, in the 1940s in Oran, which is a port city, an Algerian port city, and it follows a few main characters, but primarily the focus, it tells the story of the whole city through the plague and through a few main characters, but our focus character is Dr. Bernard Rieu, who is a doctor in the city, and very early on he recognizes the plague when he notices a bunch of rats start dying in the city, is sort of how it begins. He notices and sets out to sort of treat this outbreak of plague. So it functions on that level as sort of the story of Dr. Rieu trying to fight the plague, but also on this other level as sort of a journalistic account of life in the city throughout the outbreak. It's written from this collective kind of, it's written from a narrator, but there's lots of passages talking about like just the general collective sense of the town. In the very beginning, the author really emphasizes the fact that the town is very ordinary. And he talks about the habits and general lifestyles of the people as being very normal. And then we see all of that breaking down as the plague kind of continues on into the city. So as you can imagine, it bears some similarities to the experiences we've all had this year in the US since March with the coronavirus pandemic. Don, what inspired you to pick up this book? It's definitely not a light read.
Of course, it's my experience during the pandemic gave me a lot of time to just save my travel time. I don't need to go to office every day. And I have a lot of time to read, a lot of time to think, and also it's unless there's a very, very important physically face-to-face to meeting, most the friends I met is going to go through the like Earth to go through the Zoom. So it's and also there's a very, very important difference between you and me. Is I got this coronavirus, the information, and much earlier than American people in this country. People start to realize that something happened. It's probably around March, but this virus originally is found in Wuhan, China. So it's I got all the online information about the Wuhan, the people, how they die, how the hospital filled with the people, and the people lying in the corridor, and all the government, how they respond, and the whole city, like 30 million people immediately locked in the city, cannot move, no in, no out. So all these triggers my I cannot say it's philosophical, but trigger me is how to think about this country. And this country start to get the first case in Washington State, and then immediately coming to California, and then New York. At that time, it's the people still kind of react. It's nothing important, nothing serious. This is the attitude for the people. Even you have a face mask in the supermarket, people still say you are sick. Those kind of things happen exactly the repeated pattern in mainland China there. So these kind of things remind me Camus' the book Plague. So it's I think this is a good time. So we read this book, not only you and me, but everyone should read it. It's so vivid to reflect our human nature, especially the meaning of life, because we kind of stop here and pause our life. Now it's for a year, and then you can see what's the meaning of our life every day. And at the very beginning, the people on the social media to post what I have done today, what I done tomorrow, and they try to find some new stuff. But now, I think most people stop to post their life because every day is repetitive, same pattern, do the same thing, and couldn't go anywhere, and couldn't post any new photos. That kind of things causes, I think, for me, for you, or for most people, we can think about it. What's the meaning of life? As for the Asian community, it's the immediate my response is it's a crime, or it's a hatred, or it's some scapegoat. Those kind of response, because Trump say this is a Wuhan virus, this is a China virus. But my understanding, I know when people they have an economic suffering of employment or economic deterioration, and they are looking for something else, especially for the politicians. They can switch the whole target into the foreign countries or foreign peoples. So it's but as the Asian community in this country, we're probably going to be suffered by the people they hate. If they have people die, they have some suffering, the economic tragedy. So it's the hate crime towards Asian has been raised a lot. So it's I think this novel is going to directly, indirectly to reflect these kind of things. I think if I pick up this book and we can go through from a very beginning and the middle and the end, how human we treat each other, we can interact each other, and how to use the love, humanity, and also it's how to deal with the hatred. These kind of things I think is pretty inspired me to read this book.
Yeah, and I think you're like hitting the nail right on the head there when you said like the pandemic, and also this book really gets you to start thinking about the meaning of life when your day to day becomes so like monotonous and the same thing over and over again. I think that's definitely reflected in this book, and also just in Camus' work more general. He was a big humanist, and so kind of wanted to jump in and give a little bit of background about his career and the historical context for his novel. So he was a French Algerian writer. So he was born in Algeria in 1913. He didn't live very long. He died in 1960 in kind of a car accident. But his citizenship was French though, because at that time, Algeria was a colony of the French. And he was also in Paris when the Germans invaded France during World War II in 1940, and served as the editor-in-chief of an outlawed newspaper during that time. So he was in the resistance. And so throughout his career, he's kind of very interested both in the deeply personal things and the political things. He was an existentialist, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. and he received a Nobel Prize for some of his work. His other most famous novel that you might have heard of is called The Stranger, and that was published in 1942, so a little bit before this one. But this particular book, The Plague, was written while Camus was stuck in Iran, separated from his wife due to the war. So he's very much reacting to the environment he lived in at the time. He wrote about a fictionalized version of the city that he was actually trapped in, of people being stuck. So I think there's also a lot of like echoes of his own life in this story, as well as our own, our personal experiences.
Yeah, it's when you mentioned his first novel, Stranger. That's the book bring Camus to my attention. I read The Stranger many times. It's so deep and touchy. You keep you thinking about his philosophy, and also there are several others extensive. It's those people. It's just when I read Stranger, I feel so depressed. Similarly, at the beginning of this book, you just feel our life is meaningless. But when you go through most of his book, after it, there's a different. It's the opposite of depression. So it's the same thing. When I talk to you, talk to the audience here, friends here, I hope we can overcome this kind of a frustration of life and the struggle. And I think there is another philosophical book he wrote is about the myth of Sisyphus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He thought a lot about the myth of Sisyphus.
That's the philosophy I like it so much. So it's whenever I feel isolated, I feel depressed, I feel just repetitive to repeat the cooking, shopping, and the reading, and then you can feel it's even the life is boring, meaningless. We still have something we can accomplish.
Yeah. So you're already like kind of hinting at the end there. I'm so excited that we're going to get to that later. But first, we have to go into the darkness of the plague and talk about what happens to the citizens of Iran. And I think this is there were so many. I was like listening to the audiobook and reading like with a pencil, and you can see my little like pink post-it flags because there are so many lines that I was like, that is absolutely how I felt in March or like June or at various points throughout this pandemic year. So like I mentioned before, the story kind of begins in this very ordinary way. He's describing the city. He talks about how the people work on the weekdays, and on the weekends they like to go outside and go swimming because Iran is on the coast. But then kind of our central character, Dr. Ryu, realizes these rats have been appearing and dying all over the city, are carrying the plague. And we begin seeing how citizens and authorities and journalists react. I don't know about you, but this was the section that reminded me the most of the present. There's a line somewhere towards the beginning of the book where at the beginning of the pandemic, Camus writes that for the present, the citizens of Iran were not unemployed. They were merely on holiday. So it was on fine days towards 3 p.m, Iran brought to mind a city where public rejoicings are in progress, shops are shut, and traffic is stopped to give merrymaking populace freedom of the streets. And so that was definitely how I felt a little bit at the beginning of the pandemic when we all thought, oh, this is going to be a few weeks. I went home from college to spend some extra time with my family, and my sisters were home and my little brother was home, and we got to go on walks every day and sit down and have long dinners. What stood out to you from the beginning part of the book?
Yeah, it's at the very beginning, I feel a little bit depressed. It's very, very scary. It's when you imagine the dead rats on the street, and 100,000, it can feel disgusting and very scary, especially for the doorman. I think the guy is Michael. Yeah, the doorman is found the rats and the initial said our building can never have a rats, and later is he's got the plague as the first victim of the entire book. Those kind of things make me remind uh, the first initial the news break out from mainland China. That's the almost the typically response of people and the doctor, the whistleblower, and announce in very small circle of his friends says that we have some disease just like a SARS like 5 years ago, and they don't have a name yet, but they know it's some kind of a very serious disease. There are only 7 people. But this guy has been immediately put into the jail by Chinese government. Say you are a whistleblower, you just disturb the social stability. And after this, he was put in jail. The other girl, I think it's only like 20 years old. She started write a journal about the pandemic every day, and put on the journal on the WeChat or on the internet to draw like a 10 million reader read her journal every day, because official news like this country is they all say it's a fake news. So it's they read this particular girls that we call it a fun journal. So everybody read her journal to go to deal with the pandemic in China. And so it's in March when we have a real pandemic in this country, I have been mentally experienced so many stories there already. It's so vivid. I know the people dying. I know the people how people struggle in the hospital there, and also we have spent like a first 2 months in January and February. We try to looking for face mask in the Home Depot, Target, everywhere I can go. I just bought all the face masks and shipped to China. We never think we need a face mask later. So that's the kind of experience. When we read the first chapter, second chapter, I said, oh my God, this is exactly the beginning of the pandemic. It's so history, just kind of a repetitive, just to show the pattern. And we should learn from this kind of things.
Yeah, Camus emphasizes over and over again also that like all of the citizens of Iran really thought that this surely wasn't happening to them. He says, in this respect, our townsfolk were like everybody else, wrapped up in themselves. In other words, they were humanists and they disbelieved in pestilences. They fancied themselves free, and no one will ever be free as long as there are pestilences. So like when the pandemic starts, or the plague starts rather in the novel, the authorities, the government decide that they don't want to call it a plague because they don't want people to panic. And I just thought immediately, of course, of what had happened here. And there was another moment. Oh yeah, and he also talks about the newspapers not publishing anything about the rats and just kind of ignoring everyone going about their normal life, so that by the time everyone's kind of grappling with the plague, it's so big and so in front of them. He says that this disease is so bad that even the people who don't have the plague can't do anything but think about how terrible the plague is. And so as the plague kind of rages on, the authorities of Iran decide to shut the gates of the city. And so it becomes critics later talk about it as being a novel about exile, because everyone in the city is exiled from the outside world. And we see how our various characters kind of deal with their new lives. And I think that's a really great way to kind of enter into Camus' philosophy in this book. He's a very philosophically oriented writer, and he's strongly associated with the existentialism. So he's interested in trying to confront death and determine the meaning of life without leaning on any kind of religious framework, as a lot of like very politically and philosophically active people were at that time when he was writing in the early 20th century. And so in particular, most obviously in The Plague, he explores themes of the absurd. So like, how do we determine meaning when we're faced with irrational and random injustice of the universe, like a disease, a plague that can kind of come through and kill indiscriminately? We see at least in this pandemic, in The Plague, in the novel, there's really no logic to who lives and dies. There are young children who die, as well as older adults, and there's not any kind of systemic way in which people are killed. And so he's definitely interested in figuring out how do humans find meaning in this situation when an outbreak kills indiscriminately without reason. And so we see this especially in the debates between Dr. Ryu, who's kind of the main character, and the sermons of Father Panelu, who's the priest in the town. He gives two really big sermons that are kind of bookends in the text. And so Ryu, though, is the one who most closely mirrors Camus. He kind of sets out his philosophy of life pretty directly in a debate that he has with Father Panelu. He sees that whether or not there is a God who sees or causes the suffering in this world, as humans, we're obligated to try and help people in need and try to alleviate suffering. And so that's exactly what Dr. Ryu does. He goes and dedicates his entire life to trying to fight the plague as best he can. And this kind of attitude that the only thing we can do is help people is also really apparent in the character of Jean Theroux, or maybe it's Jean, the character of Jean Theroux. Don, could you tell us a little bit about him and how he decides to cope with this plague?
I don't know why you pick me up for describe this particular person. This is a character, I like two characters in this book. One is Dr. Ray, and the other one is Jean Theroux. Jean Theroux is just a visitor, accidentally has been imprisoned in this small town city with the doctors. And originally he tried to escape back to France to reunite with his wife, but later he gave up and be the first volunteer organizer to start to help people to do all the volunteers work. This is the person always kind of the life I have. I always try to enlarge the meaning of my personal life, try to help others. This is the character I like because I'm kind of a person just like him. And whenever you face challenge or troubles, it's not you cannot escape by yourself, but you need to jump in to take a responsibility and mobilize more people to work together. I don't believe in God at all. I don't have a religion. I tried, but didn't go through. But I do have my code of a moral kind of a responsibility, especially during this kind of a pandemic. It's touched entire human being from country to country. So any board of any country now is the same as the useless, or human being is just the entire is the one unity. You have to help each other and respond to your own behavior and try to help others. So I like this character, but unfortunately he was died before the dawn of the light. So that's the character. I think it's most Camus' philosophy to the meaning of life somehow reflect from this particular person. That's the very positive, encouraging, and try to get people even you face random meaningless word, and you still have some joy and responsibility when you get full engaged in your life every day. Whenever you wake up, you pray, you're happy, you think, I have another day, I can do something for the other people. That's kind of a philosophy, or it's the simple, uh, Sisyphus just rolling the stone to the top, and then it's a roll back again. Those kind of things is I like this character so much.
Yeah, he's a really strong character. And he does really like lay out a lot of the philosophy for this book. He talks about kind of how heroism and like going out and being brave is overrated, especially in the face of the plague. He talks about what we really have to do is that the plague is a matter of common decency, of trying to do the best for other people that you can. And so I found him also to be a really compelling and interesting character to kind of flesh out Camus' perspective about how we confront such horrible tragedies like a plague, but also other things. So another really interesting feature of the text that we haven't talked about yet is the narrator. And I will insert a spoiler here. So if you want to read the book yourself and you don't want to have this revealed, you should skip ahead by a few minutes. I don't think this ruins it though, by any means. You can definitely still enjoy the novel. But the narrator is kind of referring to himself in the first person and drawing on all these different perspectives throughout the book. But then at the very end of the story, we find out that it has been Dr. Ryu has been the narrator all along. Don, what did you think of that reveal?
Yeah, this is I have a think about this one. It's repeatedly figure out what's the intention of author or Camus, why he's used this technique, the writing technique, to review the author at the very last of the chapter. But for myself, it's even you don't reveal who is the author or who is the narrator, I still enjoy the book. So but somehow it's the last chapter to reveal the author. For me, I don't catch. This is probably it's a professional like you. You have your major is literature, and can tell our friend here what's the meaning and why do this one. Philosophically, I couldn't figure out why it's put there and do this kind of tactics, and that's honestly I have no conclusion of this kind of arrangement. Any thought of you? You can give us some education about this kind of citing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand why Camus would have made that decision either. I think part of the reasoning might just be that he's because Ryu has been like just a practical reason, because he's been attuned to the pandemic, kind of the plague coming more so than any of the other characters that we meet, and any of the other people in Oran. He's well positioned to be kind of keeping details of the plague and to be recounting them to us. But I think also at the end, revealing Ryu as the narrator, it is maybe kind of, I almost would consider it kind of Camus revealing his hand and saying like, this is what I think, and this is my personal perspective about this plague. Because as we'll get into when we talk about the ending, there's sort of a lot of reflection then finally at the end by Dr. Ryu about what this experience has meant for him when he's been working so hard, and ultimately he doesn't really have an effect on whether or not the pandemic ends. He just fights to save as many people as he can, and until suddenly they sort of stop dying. And their plague serum that they've been trying to develop for the whole book doesn't really work until one day it does. And so still he's confronted with all of this randomness that he has to sort of just get up and work every day too. So yeah, alongside though, we've been talking a lot about how the plague in the novel sort of literally mirrors our experience of the pandemic this year. A lot of people and literary scholars have read the plague uh, very metaphorically, sort of as an allegory. So as I pointed out earlier, Camus is really interested in the deeper philosophical meaning of these things, and of human life. And so he's generally really interested in concepts about how human beings are to treat one another, justice, all of that. And so many literary critics, kind of based on the time period in which this was written, and also Camus' personal experience as a member of the French Resistance, have argued that the plague and this sense of exile, being trapped in Iran, kind of functions as a metaphor for the occupation of France during World War II, and a celebration of all that the French resistance was not able to accomplish, but how it was able to sort of demonstrate the human spirit in the face of randomness and evil. Um, and as well as kind of an indictment of the French who collaborated with the Vichy regime or just didn't take the threat of Hitler and Nazism seriously enough. So I actually found a really interesting essay that was published in April, so earlier on in the pandemic in the US. This was written by a woman who, at the time when the pandemic started, was translating the novel. It was originally published in French. She didn't mention in the article, though, what language she was translating it into. And so this was published in the New York Times, written by Laura Maris. And she wrote, kind of hoping that the plague and novels like it could serve as a sort of plague serum or a vaccination, a collective antibody, she says, for humanity going forward as we face challenges beyond the current pandemic. So I wanted to read a little bit of what she had to say, and then hear your thoughts. She says that unlike many of Camus' contemporaries, he took the long view. The heroism of the resistance was less important than how humanity could be restored after the war. In a speech that he gave in 1946, he pushed for a post-war return to the human scale, calling hatred and indifference symptoms of this crisis. He refused to let his country off the hook for its role in spreading this illness. And it's too easy on this point to simply accuse Hitler and say that the snake has been destroyed, the venom gone, because we know perfectly well the venom is not gone, that each of us carries it in our own hearts. That's a quote from Camus. And so Maris continues on to say that while he knew that people carried traces of hatred, he was also hoping that those traces could be disarmed as cultural antibodies. In the same speech, he called for creating, quote, communities of thought outside parties and governments to launch a dialogue across national boundaries. The members of these communities will affirm by their lives and their words that this world must cease to be the world of police, soldiers, and money, and become the world of men and women, of fruitful work and thoughtful play. In response to the symptoms of war, Camus saw shared consciousness as a healing force, becoming particularly interested in how people could develop a global collectivity that would protect them against nationalism and fascism. Writing the plague in the form of historical chronicle was a hopeful gesture, implying human continuity, a vessel to carry the memory of war as an inoculation against future armed conflicts. So, kind of carrying Maris's very long and complex argument on, the plague not only teaches us about how humans can solve big problems if they come together collectively to do so, or at least confront big problems, but also about how we have to keep the memory of these events alive, so that we can learn from our mistakes in the future. I recently was on Christmas Eve, I had a conversation with some friends about how much of our lives will remain online after this pandemic, sort of thinking about like when we are able to go back to normal, what will we choose to do? And given that the pandemic proved that so much of what we used to do in person can be done digitally, I'm hoping still that we take away what you can take away from this book, I think, is that social connections are so meaningful and important. And that I really hope that we learn to build better communities after this pandemic, because from the people who've been stuck alone in, you know, tiny apartments in New York City, to the people who have been stuck with their families or wherever we have been kind of trapped and exiled this year, like the citizens of Iran. I think at least I've come to realize how important community is. So, Don, besides the similarities between the onset of the plague and the onset of our current pandemic, what are your big takeaways from the book?
Yeah, I think it's just like stated at the very beginning. This book is just for me and for everyone, it's a kind of I can feel there's some crisis in we facing for the entire human being, especially it's the after 2 years the campaign, presidential campaign, we are looking for the future. There's a wave of technology, wave of AI, and a lot of regular job is going to eliminate, and pandemic is going to speed up this process. A lot of we call normal people, like a clerk, cashier, their job going to gone. And when they couldn't find job, social stability and the inequality in this society going to be becoming larger and larger. And there's someone is going to be the scapegoat to be the hurt. And that's if our president keeps saying the Wuhan virus, Chinese virus, some people are going to, that's my selfish feeling some kind of a crisis, especially maybe after 3-6 months later, when the cash relief fund is used up and the employment keep going up, the social inequality going to be surfing more and more, causing more trouble. And I think it's people read this book and absorb some positive energy, try to extend our love and humanity to the others. I think it's very, very meaningful. And also I feel very encouraged after reading this book. It's so excited to share with people. And his philosophy is that I have accepted a lot. And regardless of whatever that we can do, and I think it's with all the medicine development and all the doctors and the nurses in the hospital. I have so many friends, they working in the hospitals. They don't think they are heroes or heroes. They just think they do their job, just like the Camus, the Dr. Reed described himself. So I think it's that we need to appreciate all the people fighting for the coronavirus, and if we can do anything, we just jump in to work with all the people together.
Yeah, I think that's like a really great takeaway to get from this. And yeah, I also was really struck by Theroux's philosophy as well. We find out very late in the novel that he had spent the early part of his life campaigning against the death penalty. And he kind of spells out this metaphor really clearly when between pestilence and just human suffering in general and the horrible things that people across the world always have to go through. He says that all I maintain is that on earth there are pestilences and there are victims, and it's up to us so far as possible not to join forces with the pestilences. So I think that really made me think of this year. The pandemic is not quite so random as the one in the plague, where truly anyone can die. We have definitely, I think this pandemic has revealed who's vulnerable in our society and who we could be doing more to help. So I also hope that we'll all be taking kind of a note from Theroux and trying to not to join forces with the pestilences and oppressions of this world, but to fight against those things. So I also wanted to take some time to talk about the conclusion. On the one hand, it's really hopeful. Camus has some of these really beautiful sentences about everyone coming back into the streets and just how the city kind of came back to life after the pandemic. But Dr. Ryu also gives us a hint that the plague never really dies out. It just lives dormant and can reemerge at any time. How did that strike you as an ending?
Yeah, that's exactly is a philosophical, just give people some kind of a warning about our life. I think it's before he wrote this book, there have at least 4 different plague before he's write this novel Plague. So it's the same thing. You see that the human history, there's always kind of a disease happening, the spreading around the world, and this kind of things that we need to. At the very beginning of this pandemic, I started feeling, I'm so fortunate to experience such a tragedy and so impact every aspect of our life. And now it's at the end, Camus say, okay, now you experience a unique experience. All the human beings, sometimes they will suffer the pandemic or something is the human cannot control the environment. Not today, maybe if even we have a vaccines coming out, and maybe a couple of years later, it's a plague or pandemics coming back again. So it's when worse things happen, especially touch everyone's aspect, you can see people's human nature reviewed on every event, every aspect they reflect it. So we know it's how how kind of some people and how ugly some human natures, how selfish. Those kind of a comparison or contrast and give us the more meaningful life. This is I feel so enjoyed every day. You sit here and quietly just watch the entire the world, how we deal with this pandemic from government, including the federal, state, even local, on the different level, publicly elected official, they treat the pandemic is all different. And for the individually, personally, you can see how we deal with our family, friends, and how we deal with a colleague, and whenever things happen, how we treat each other. It's so affluent, reflect our life here.
Yeah, I definitely think he's also like warning us to stay vigilant and like keep our eyes open for whatever the next plague will be next, whether it's a literal pandemic in our case this year or just injustice more broadly. So I really enjoyed like getting to debrief that book with you, but I think we should lighten the mood a little bit before we close. So we will sort of transition into our regular segment to talk about what is keeping us entertained this week. So Don, what's keeping you entertained this week?
It's the most my life doesn't affect me too much. Is I keep outdoor playing. It's each week I try to play golf twice. So there's this year's golf, the market is just so good. You cannot book tee time. So every golf course is packed, and the rate, they never give you a discount anymore. They used to give you a discount. Now it's every golf course, you have to book the tee time 2 weeks ahead. Otherwise, you can never get a chance to play. So I try to search the golf course around the entire Bay Area and try to find a spot and I can play. That's the ways I keep myself. I can stay in the outdoor activity, do exercise. That's one part. In the evening, just like everyone else, I glue to the Netflix or it's Netflix and Amazon Prime, just looking for the episodes to watch.
Yeah, it's always so fun to hear about like what businesses are thriving in the pandemic. Golf courses is not one that I would have guessed about. But that, like, when you think about it, yeah, nobody has anywhere to be. So of course they want to be on the golf course. Totally makes sense. I am a little bit of a couch potato. I got a bike for Christmas that I need to like make myself take out more often. But if you're feeling a little more cozy, want to stay inside, for your winter binging, I definitely recommend The Great British Baking Show if you haven't already seen it. Also called Bake Off sometimes, I think. So it's available on Netflix in the US, and it's just a delightful cooking competition with amateur but like very crazy talented bakers from across the UK. But unlike a lot of other reality and competition shows, they don't really try to create drama between the contestants. They all just seem like really good friends, and they enjoy one another's company. They even help each other sometimes when they're like struggling with a challenge. So it's just really lovely, and of course also a great chance to listen to some English, Irish, and Scottish accents, which I always find enjoyable. So I have really, it's just a really cozy, kind environment. And I love binging it sometimes also on Zoom with my family. So I have really enjoyed talking about the plague with you, sort of trying to dive into the deep questions of the meaning of life. And I'll look forward to talking to you again next week. We'll wrap it up there. Don, thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's enjoyed talking with you about the book. Everything I think it's our episode is keep going, and every time when we talk, and I think I can learn a lot from you. And also, I hope our audience can jump in and give us some feedback, and then motivate us and continue this episode.
My name is Katie Simpson. Our podcast is sponsored by Asian American Forward. You can visit our website at asianamericanforward.com. If you enjoyed the show this week or have a topic you'd like to hear us discuss on a future episode, send us your comments at info@asianamericanforward.com. We'd love to hear from you. You can also find us on Facebook and hear more conversations between Don and I at our YouTube channel. If you're a fan of the show, leave us a review in the Apple Podcast Store or tell someone If you're a fan of the show, I'm going to do it again. If you're a fan of the show, leave us a review in the Apple Podcast Store or tell someone about us. It really helps people find the show. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.